Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our NSI monthly study circle meeting. Today, Comrade Sreedhara is going to introduce us to another book by Johannes Bronkhorst. As we know, he is one of the most influential scholar in ancient Indian religions, cultures, philosophy, and their mutual interaction and how they shaped each other. And he has devoted his entire life in studying ancient Indian thought, culture, religion, and language. And he recently passed away last year. Um, is through his seminal studies, we the whole world got educated about the rise of Jainism, Buddhism, and Brahmanism finally, and how they mutually interacted and how the Brahmanism raised as a dominant ideology in this country, and how many of the important tenets of Indian ideology, like karma, meditation, asceticism, all those aspects are how they are born not in Vedic tradition, but in non-Vedic traditions, and how Buddhism, Jainism adopted them, and finally how they have to struggle with increasingly dominant Brahminical environment. So today, um, Sridhar is going to introduce us to his one of the most important works, Buddhism under the influence of Brahmanism. So I request Comrade Sridhar to take us through this book.
Thank you, comrades. So this is our another attempt to read Bronkhorst, um, who who just died last year, May 25. So he was active perhaps till then, and among his many books, the three books are considered very important. One is the Greater Magadha, which is actually a background for his study on how the Brahmins won, that which we read last time, and also the book that we are reading today, Brahmins in the Shadow of Buddhist Buddhism in the Shadow of Brahminism. This book was published in 2011, while Greater Magadha was published in 2017, and How the Brahmins Won in 2016. That's the chronology. But if you browse through the net and ask what are those important books that we should read, it mentions again these three books plus two more books, which I think in a way forms the corpus of his scholarship. Apart from these three, there's also two more works like Buddhist teaching in India, and the origin of Indian philosophy. So I think put together, these five books will give us a comprehensive outlook on ancient India and how the many things that we take for granted emerged. So when we come to this point, Buddhism and Brahminism, we have a very usual scholarship tendency is to understand Buddhism as a reaction, a revolt against Brahminism, Brahminical practices, and it continued for several centuries, after which it slowly disappeared. So Ambedkar calls that a revolution in the history of India, and then the downfall of Buddhism and the re-emergence of Hinduism as the counter-revolution. And it's very interesting that we can compare Ambedkar, not here, but it will be another journey to compare Ambedkar and Bronkhorst about how they vary and agree. For instance, Ambedkar was largely, focusing on social causes, societal changes happening, and he also had a very definite agenda to prove something. So Ambedkar, Bronkhost, on the other hand, is an academic, and he doesn't have any agenda like that. So he is an Indologist. Like that, he goes on to study various documents, inscriptions, textual, non-textual evidences. And that methodology is very interesting because though he quotes a lot of works and references, he also examines them. And even if he is not agreeing with them, he very patiently analyzes the passages that he doesn't agree with and then shows how there is no need to agree with it and why there are more evidences. In other words, the way he marshals the corpus of evidence that he has collected, which is enormous, of course, is a very fascinating story, a fascinating way in which he brings out his arguments. So generally, when we talk about this Brahmanism and Buddhism, there is one side we have Ambedkar with a very clear binary position, and reading that with Robila Topper and Bronkhorst would actually give us it's kind of limitations that Ambedkar's study of history has. We may not go into that right now, but it's again, I'm suggesting it's an interesting thing to probe. Anyway, let's leave it at that and concentrate on this. This book borrows heavily from his earlier book, which is a very major study that he undertook called the Greater Magadha, which is a study of North India since the time of Greeks to the Mauryans. But it is also in this region, that Buddhism emerged. Brahmanism also not emerged, but Brahmanism had to contend with various sources. And under Greeks, particularly, we have seen last time an elaborate account of how the Brahmins got threatened and they had to move elsewhere, more eastwards and southwards. So they were all scattered at that time. And the major point he makes is that Brahmanism was not a dominant worldview at that time. Brahmanism was not the dominant vision of society. They stuck to their ideas, no doubt, of Varnas and others, but there were very few buyers for that, including Ashoka. So Buddhism emerged at a time when Brahmanism was still weak as a societal ideology. That's the first point. And he also talks about how did Brahmanism ultimately reinvented itself, both politically, socially. It reinvented and became dominant. In other words, how did this counter-revolution, to borrow the Ambedkar phrase, happen? And also, how did Buddhism disappear? So there are many accounts of why Buddhism disappeared. We shall not go into that in great detail now, but we will touch upon that somewhere later. Though this word disappear needs clarification now because there are recent books that suggest that in India there is an undercurrent of Buddhist current, not necessarily because Ambedkar embraced Buddhism with a lot of followers, but even otherwise, the way India adopted Dharma Chakra, the symbols, the lions, the iconography, etc., suggests that it was not dead totally. Anyway, that's also another interesting book by Navayan. I forget the name, but it tells us how Buddhism completely did not disappear in India, but continued its sway, although in a very, let's say, subterranean way. So these are the three major concerns of this book, to put it in a nutshell. So let's begin with the chapter 1. So today I'll be focusing largely on this first section, which talks about the new Brahmanism, the spread of Sanskrit, the Brahmanical canonization of the past, and the Brahmanization of borrowed features. Out of that, I will touch upon these four, but largely I will provide a background to understand these four. And it may be, that's why I suggested that we possibly will read it in 2 sessions. And in the next, we can talk about Buddhism confronted with Brahmanism, which has the following chapters like the courtly challenge, science religion in classical India, then Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit, Buddhism Sanskritized, Buddhism Brahminized, etc. What are the details? But why all these things happen is what we are trying to understand. And once we are clear about this, what Bronkhost is saying about this, we can understand these details more clearly. That's what I thought. So it's not to the usual opinion that Buddhism did not rise as a contrary, a revolt, a competitor. The Greater Magadha had many, many different civilizations and belief systems. Jains, Ajivakas, generally which we call the Shamanas. The Brahmins were not even dominant uh, at that time, and Varna was not still talked about. It was not accepted. And the experience with Greeks, particularly, was catastrophic that we have seen last time. It was also, he discusses it in his book, The Greater Magadha. So it made them to spread across, move to the east and south. And in this process, they had to give up some of their own belief systems and practices. For example, the sacrificial rituals, the yajna and yaga, they had to modify them in this process, and that's the transformation that happened. So they did absorb and adjust with others, as we have seen in the previous session. They did not give up their core belief that they were the ones who had the access to higher powers and therefore most suitable to advise the kings and to predict their future. So that therefore they were the most superior ones in the hierarchy is something that they did not give up, though they compromised on many, many other kind of practices and even belief systems. So even during the Mauryan Empire, they were not very influential as there were many other belief systems, as I mentioned earlier, which had certain common features like rejection of Vedic scriptures, the importance given to Vedas as an unchangeable body of knowledge. So that is one thing common in Shamana tradition. But the Shamana, some of them also believed, including Buddhism, in karma and rebirth. But it did not mean it was preordained, like Brahmins believed, to give privilege by birth through their behavior. So in the karma, according to Brahmanism, is what you do, the behavior in the previous birth, and that makes you, get born in a higher caste. That's Brahmanism. So that idea was rejected because rebirths are there, but one can happen in anywhere. The third important point about Shamana tradition is they did emphasize on renunciation, meditation, and ascetic practice. So the Shamanic tradition was rooted in the Greater Magadha. That's the point he makes very elaborately with a lot of details and quotations. And therefore, the Shamanic tradition had an idea of liberation which was different from the idea of moksha that Brahmins propounded. And lastly, the Shamanic tradition had this common belief, which means that they stressed on the ethical conduct. And Buddhism in particular was talking very highly about the impermanence of everything. So Buddhism deviated from other Ajivakas and shamanic tradition in this, that one of the unique, or what we call the USP of Buddhism, has always been the focus and emphasis on impermanence. Um, so this is roughly the background. But then, what was happening at that time in in society and politics? So that is where Bronkhost creates a vast canvas on which he paints this picture. The Mauryan Empire at that time was very large, had spread across North India and to the Gangetic Plain, the east. It was also urbanizing. That's very important. It was urbanizing, leading to the emergence of different classes, not in the way we talk about it today. Groups, let's say social groups, like traders, merchants, and different kind of artisans, etc. The powerful kingdom um, offered another condition that was favorable for the immense emergence of new religious movements, which were all tolerated and encouraged through in the Magadha period, because there was nothing like an official religious or religion patronized by the king or the state. These developments, and then another change that was happening at that time during the Magadha was that they removed the local kings and appointed governors. So whatever little support the Brahmins received from these minor kings, the Samantas, the smaller kings, that vanished because it was centrally governed. But there was nothing like an official religion. So these developments, in a way, he says, affected the Vedic thought system and belief. And they were no longer, they were not even dominant at that time. Though there were Brahmins scattered all over, but it doesn't mean there are references to Brahmins, he quotes at length, but suggests that a reference to a Brahmin here and there doesn't mean that the whole society, as a whole, rather, believed in the Brahmanical world. So the early Magadha, he says, was a land very heterogeneous in its culture, in its civilization and religious belief systems. Therefore, he says that it would be wrong to assume that Buddhism emerged as a reformation or a counterculture to the Vedic Brahminic civilization, because it had many. Rather, he says it was Jainism that it had to contend. So that's the point he makes. So when later, I'll examine it a bit later. Later, when Brahminism reinvented itself post Magadha Empire, then they created a whole body of literature, texts, and then so we will examine how this reinvention happened, and that's what he discusses in the colonization of the past, Brahminical colonization of the past, which means that. So it's not simply the colonization of the present and future, rather it's a colonization of the past, because they had to create a lot of history for themselves. And it's a process that we see even now, that Hindutva has to create that in order to move forward. That means we have to turn backwards to move forward. And that's exactly what happened long, long ago. So what is happening today is perhaps what Brahmins did in the 4th century. So these Magadhas comprised of Magadha, Videha, Angarajya, Vaji, Kosala, and Eastern territories. And Buddha spent most of his teaching career in these areas. And this is where a lot of major events happened in his life. And there are a lot of references to show that. So, Bronkhost argues that the idea of karma, rebirth, was there already in Buddhism and Jainism. And these notions were not necessarily Vedic. This is the point. They were not Vedic in origin or exclusive to it. So they also had these Shramana traditions also had this notion of karma and rebirth. The karma in them was not a result of previous accumulation across multiple lives, but simply attributed to one's action, that means deeds. The karma here means the deeds. However, the causation leading to innumerable births got into Buddhist lore also later as many Jataka stories of Bodhisattva become entrenched in the Buddhist canon. So this happened much, much later. Whereas earlier, it was simply a question of one's deeds. So among early Buddhists and Ajivakas and Jainas too, every action, they believed, created its own moral consequences. In some, this was the dominant view during the Magadha period. That there was this idea that one's action will always lead to certain consequences. Buddhist liberation, the idea of liberation or nirvana in Buddhism, did not mean reaching heaven. That was one important difference. And because there was even the heavenly existence, they thought was impermanent, because their idea of impermanence would include that also. Hence, the highest goal in Buddhism is renunciation from desire and liberation from rebirth. This, according to Bronkhost, cannot be explained away as a simple influence of the Vedic religion, because it was something rooted at the milieu of time. The Samanas hence renounced accumulation of wealth, any property, even family, and rejected ritual obligations, particularly animal sacrifice. The asceticism practiced by Buddha could be attributed to the Shramana culture, which was prevalent at that time, though Buddha ultimately renounced that also. We know how he went and meditated, became almost like a skeleton. Then when he comes out, he rejects that. However, the core Buddhist doctrine of karma and punarjanma, renunciation, and meditation were a part of the characteristic features prevalent during the Magadha Empire. So, Bronkhost argument is that Buddhism borrowed and shared these features rather than refuting and reacting to Brahmanism, Brahmins. Now, Buddha died around 400 BCE, more or less, which was the time when Alexander had made incursions into India. So this was before the creation of the Nanda and the Maurya Empire in North India. That would happen later. As we have seen in our last session, meaning how the Brahmins won. For example, Patanjali calls the heartland of Brahmins as Aryavarta. So that's the reference. That is the Brahmins before they were thrown out. Between Thar Desert and the Ganga Jamuna Sangam. That is the Aryavarta that Patanjali refers to. In Manusmriti also, which came 4 centuries later, Aryavarta gets mentioned, but in this case, it gets extended from east to west, so becomes larger than Patanjali's Aryavarta. So this means that between the 2nd century BCE and 3rd, important changes were taking place. And Brahmins of the 2nd century BCE looked upon eastern Ganges Valley as more or less a foreign territory, though it was occupied by Greeks whom they call the Yavanas. So the Brahmins of the 2nd or 3rd BCE looked upon it as the rest of the room. They thought it was their own. So Bronkhost adds that this movement is not just about spread and migration of a few Brahmins, but refers to areas which did not care about and concede to the Brahmins' claim to superiority. Only when it happens can we say that, or only when the superiority of society becomes dominant or becomes the dominant worldview or vision of society, can we say a particular area has been Brahmanized, but that had not happened at that time. So, the early kings, Bimbasara and Ajatashatru, were claimed both by Buddhists and Jains. Even Nandas, around 350 BC, were patronizing Jains. Though Chandragupta Maurya overthrew Nandas, he continued to be a Jain. Now, Bindusara patronized Ajivakas. Though Ashoka was interested in Buddhism, his successors supported Jainas and Ajivakas again. Maybe it was during the Shunga period that Ambedkar refers to extensively that Brahmins began to occupy prominent places. Now, archaeological evidences show that Vedic and post-Vedic literature contain very little about the culture of the eastern neighbors. So there is reference only in the Shatapatha Brahmana, a reference to the sepulchral mounds, the stupas, and not the four-cornered ones. So the reference to stupa first we see in the Shatapatha Brahmana, which means it was there at that time. And philosophically, ideologically, as we saw, the deeds and the karmic retribution was an attribute in all these Samanaya traditions. Jainism, for example, believed in this in such a way that they advocated abstaining from all activity, in fact, in both physical and mental. So the ultimate liberation for Jainas is a lekhana where they give up even their life, breathing, everything, slowly. So, which means here that there should be no more action in any sense of the term, physical and mental. And earlier deeds, whatever deeds one may have done in the past life, would be rendered ineffectual by doing this strict kind of abstinence. So for Jainas, it's not enough to abstinate from food and other things, but one has to retreat even from life itself to be liberated. But we know that Buddhism doesn't talk about this. So therefore, the question of self, what is it that self? Because the kind of belief system in Vedas says that the self is unmoved, untouched by one's deeds. So that's the difference between Jainism and this. The self remains untouched. So whatever you do, it's only the physical form. So there is nothing good or bad about the self. So understanding the self is a crucial way to understand the difference between these philosophical traditions. So it's possible that the self can be attributed to the karma, but it cannot be attributed to karma because it is untouched. But Buddhism was influenced by this idea of an unsullied, unaffected self. So the early Buddhist text talks about this kind of self that is unsullied, that remains unaffected. But though it was not acquainted with the notion of the self in the way the Vedic projection of self, Buddhists finally rejected that, saying that feelings, that is Vedana, the habitual tendencies like one's samskara, consciousness like prajna or vijnana, they are all impermanent. So Buddha says, to quote, I'll quote a line from here now. Second. Ah, the self is what one really is, different from one's body and one's frame of mind. This core of one's being, this self, I'm quoting, does not act. It is easy to understand that, seen from a vantage point of this knowledge, all karmic retribution is in the end based on a colossal misunderstanding. Deeds are carried out by body and mind, neither of which are to be identified with the self. This self is different from both body and mind and carries no activities whatsoever. Since I am the self rather than my body or my mind, I cannot be affected by karmic retribution. So this idea was something that the Buddhists rejected totally. So they said, though they were acquainted with that notion, they did not accept it. So there is this, in the second sermon, there is this very interesting debate. And after asking, is your body, what is actually sense? It's pain, it's sorrow, this and that. He says, asked, I quote, this is from the sermon, second sermon of the Buddha. Wherefore, monks, whatever is body, past, future, present, or internal or external, or gross or subtle, or low or excellent, whether it is far or near, all body should, by means of right wisdom, be seen as it really is. True. Thus, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. Whatever feeling, whatever perception, whatever are the habitual tendencies, whatever the consciousness, so the samskara, prajna, etc., buddhi, whether past, future, present, or internal or external, gross or subtle, low or excellent, whether it is far or near, all consciousness should by means of right wisdom be seen as it really is. Thus, this is not mine, this I am not. So, this passage, Bronkhorst comments, does not say that it accepts the existence of such a self. It merely states that anything which is impermanent, painful, and of a nature to change cannot be the self. So there is a self, but this rules out five constituents of the person here enumerated, five senses. Since no other candidates are mentioned, there are no other than the fifth, this may imply that the existence of a self of this nature is implicitly rejected. This is not, however, explicitly stated. There, because the aim of the teaching of Buddha is evidently not to discover the real self. That's not the concern here. In his teaching, the insights that the self does not play a part in the activities of body and mind does not help to attain liberation. On the contrary, the preoccupation with the true nature of the self has to be given up. Only then one is ready to follow the path shown by the Buddha. That's the core element in the early Buddhism. It continues also. That means that you have given up this search for the self itself. Seen from this practical point of view, the question as to the existence of the self is of minor importance in Buddhism. The main thing is that knowledge of the self plays no useful role on the Buddha's path to liberation. So, if this is the difference between their idea of notion of self, the karma, and therefore the practice of the ascetic life, which was quite different from that of Jainas, was propounded by the Buddha in his suttas. To quote again from the original text, I'm quoting, quote, it goes almost without saying that a number of those converts brought along with them some of the other beliefs and practices, some of which did not agree with the vision of Buddhism's founder. So when people came to Buddhism, they carried with them the bag of their earlier belief systems. Some converts kept in this manner the conviction that the best way to remedy karmic retribution was to abstain from all activity. The link between means and end in this case seemed to be so obvious for them that one can hardly blame them for having preserved these forms of asceticism. So they did carry, when they practiced asceticism, some of the earlier notions of the karma. So it means that it was a mixed bag in those days. Um, but also to be noted is that Buddhism introduced innovations into the realm of ideas and practices. This had an advantage, obviously, for Buddhism because the Buddhist texts state repeatedly that the Buddha taught something new, something that had not therefore been known in this world. The method does not deny that the teaching of the Buddha shared certain features with other movements from the same region. As examples, we have already mentioned the belief in rebirth and karmic retribution was shared, but only those features that it shares with those other movements, but that are also rejected in the canon, must be looked upon with suspicion. Because, so this is what that makes a little confusion when we get into what exactly um, was the form of Buddhism, because it was something new. It also carried the baggage of something that previously people believed in. So that, according to Bronkhost, has made, quote, too many scholars have used the obscurity that surrounds early Buddhism as an excuse to propose more or less fanciful theories. We do not need more of those. It is at the same time clear that research moves forward by way of conjectures and refutations. This means that those who are not willing to pay attention to serious hypotheses contribute to a process which renders an interesting and legitimate field of inquiry sterile. That is the introductory, kind of Bronkhorst should take on how history should be read, how research should go on. So, as we move into the past, there are a lot of conjectures and refutations. Therefore, bringing a lot of intertextuality, according to Bronkhorst, is one way to prove a hypothesis either correct or wrong, which is what he's trying to say. So I think that there he dwells on this at a greater length in his book, The Buddhist Teaching in India. It's a 2009 publication, which may also be very interesting for us to read if you want. So therefore, Buddhist canon has both authentic and non-authentic Buddhist practices and ideas. And examining these practices in Greater Magadha helps us to sift the two. That's what he tries to do. So this method, according to Bronkhost, has the following advantage. This is an advantage. One second, I just read one line from him. Scrolling. Anyway, I think I lost the page. Sorry, it's 13. So it's there. One second. The advantage is that we need to look at all the conjectures made earlier with suspicion, bring new studies based on inscriptions and other textual references. So this shifting is also important for another important reason, because as I quoted, there are too many claims and scholarship claiming different kind of hypothesis. And this book tries to keep this puzzle in mind because there has been a long dispute regarding the original teachings of the Buddha and what was ascribed to him later. For example, did Buddha invent a special form of yoga? So there are claims that he did, and there are counterclaims saying it is not. Is it borrowed from the other sources? So these are kind of gray areas. Now, Bronkhorst says that both are wrong because though there was classical yoga common with Buddhists in several parts of India, and this is due to the influence of Buddhism and yoga several centuries after the death of Buddha. So they reinvented this. So that's why this reinvention keeps happening. The main reference about the pre-classical yoga is regarding the practice of Jainas, who used it to suppress bodily and mental activities. So, according to Bronkhost, his evidence shows that the original reference to yoga and yogic practices is a contribution from the Jainas because they wanted it to practice their abstinence from bodily and mental activities. But it traveled so much that ultimately the Buddhist literature started claiming that there is a distinct called uh, Buddhist yoga, and Buddha himself was a yogi. So, Bronkhorst says that even in Ashoka's inscriptions, there has been no reference to Buddhism as such. Um, though he talks about dharma, that dharma that Buddha talks about has been ascribed to Buddhism, but not so. That's the point Bronkhorst makes. He quotes another scholar, K.R. Norman, who has a book on the philosophical approach to Buddhism, 2006 publication. So in this chapter on Buddhism and Ashoka, Norman argues that the term dharma in Ashoka's inscriptions cannot be identified with Buddha dharma. For example, I quote, Ashoka's dharma is set out clearly in several inscriptions. For example, in a concise form in the second minor rock edict. Obey one's parents, obey one's elders, be kind to living creatures, tell the truth. All this is said to be in accordance with the ancient usage. Elsewhere in the third rock edict, a slightly expanded version of this is given. Obedience to mother and father is good. Liberality to friends, acquaintances, and relatives, to Brahmins and Samanas is good. Abstention from killing animals is good. Moderation in expenditure and moderation in possessions is good. So, according to Norman, because of the reference to abstinence from expenditure, from possessions, etc., people attribute it to the influence of Buddha and Ashoka. But the edicts do not mention Buddhism per se. Of course, it does mention Brahmins, but only along with others, because as we mentioned earlier, at that time there were many religious beliefs which were tolerated. So the dharma that he talks about should not be confused with Buddhism. To the point he makes, because Buddha Ashoka was very secular and very inclusive and non-partisan. So normal arguments, which Bronkhorst almost quotes with approval, um, continues to say that Ashoka's dharma was not the same as the Buddha's dharma. Therefore, the argument that Buddhism was Ashoka's state religion is off the mark, to quote, as there are no reference to Buddhist Four Noble Truths in Ashoka. Because that these edicts were moral than religious, they carried a missionary zeal, which was mistaken as a religious propaganda. The 13th major rock edict is quoted by Romila Thapa. So, in her book, The Beloved of the Gods, in her book, Romila Thapa's book. So, in this book, there is one more quotation from Ashoka. The beloved of the gods. That means that's the name that Ashoka uses. And Devanam Priya. It's translated as the beloved of the gods. So, in other words, the Devanam Priya considers victory of by dharma to be the foremost victory. This is the 13th edict. And moreover, the beloved of the gods has gained this victory on all his frontiers to a distance of 600 yojanas, about 1,500 miles, where there reigns the Greek king named Antiochus, and beyond the realm of the Antiochus in the lands of the four kings named Ptolemy, Antigonus, Magas, and Alexander. That's how the 13 super claims. And in the south were the Cholas and the Pandyas as far as Ceylon. Likewise, here in the imperial territories among the Greeks and the Kambojas, among the Nabhakas and Navapanktis, Bhojas and Pitinikas, Andhras and Parindas, everywhere the people follow the beloved of the God instruction in Dharma. Even where the envoys of the beloved of the gods have not gone, people hear of this conduct according to the Dharma, his precepts and his instruction in Dharma, and they follow Dharma and will continue to follow it. So it means that his encouragement of all sects must mean that he did not stop feeding Brahmins, and his dharma, in fact, specifically includes giving to Shamanas and Brahmins together. His donation of caves to the Ajivakas in his 12th year is additional evidence that he was not devoted exclusively to Buddhism. So these are how Bronkhost goes on quoting from inscriptions and other texts, which shows that Ashoka did not refer only to Buddhism, and Dharma for him was just a moral obligation. Now, after the death of Buddha, much of North and South India became united under an empire, which is the Greater Magadha. And we've seen that how politically they removed all the kings, and therefore whatever little support the Brahmins had from local kings also dried up. And but still, we see that there were Brahmins scattered here and there. And the next Bronkhost tries to get into this whole idea of the donation of the land. In fact, Ashoka donates certain land to in Lumbini, where he erects his stupa. And when he does that, he says, when the king Priyadarshin, that is Ashoka, dear to the gods, was consecrated for the 20th regnal year, he came in person and paid reverence to Buddha in Lumbini. Because the Buddha, the Sakyamuni, was born at that place. Ashoka had a stone railing and made a stone pillar erected because the Lord of the world, that's the Buddha, was born in this place. He exempted the village of Lumbini from taxes and granted it the 8 shares. So this quotation he analyzes to suggest that it's very important to see that the land was not given to monks or to any religious sect, but it is given to the whole people. So this is how later, when Brahmanism started reinventing, the agraharas developed. And has a separate chapter on that, which I will refer to a little later. But it is suffice to suggest here that um, so there is this argument from Romila Thapar that there were ashramas earlier, and these ashramas later gave rise to agraharas. But Bronkhost contends this and doesn't agree with Romila Thapar, saying with a lot of quotations, which I will read much, much later, maybe in the next session, shows how there were ashramas and agraharas simultaneously. Just to prove the point that they were not linear in development, they happened simultaneously. And they had two different functions. They coexisted. For example, we know the well-known ashram of of Kanmamuni. Um, it's a sacred place where only rishis stayed and the kings or the rulers made some portion available for them and they maintained it themselves. Whereas Agrahara was large tracts of land given to Brahmins. But the contrast here is that the first donation of land that Ashoka makes is not to any individual, but to the people. So this is an important uh, point for Bronkhorst to suggest that had it been had he been a Buddhist follower, ardent Buddhist follower, there would have been evidence to suggest that he donated it to a particular sect. We don't have that evidence. This is the only evidence we have, which shows that he gave it to the people, inhabitants of the village. So therefore, Brancott, agreeing with another scholar called Chopin, says that this may be because Ashoka had no idea of the monasteries, which may not have even existed at that time. They started appearing only after Buddhist groups had permanently settled down, which happened after Ashoka. The first epigraphic evidence for monastic establishment dates back to 1st century CE. By 2nd century CE, there are records of such monasteries even in Sri Lanka. There's the speed with which this spread later. With land grants, there are evidences to suggest land grants to the monasteries. So whatever may be the exact time period given here and there, it is evident that they accepted and even depended on the rich and the powerful. That is, even Buddhists started depending on the rich and powerful. For this to happen, there ought to be, there ought to have several socio-political considerations, without which why would the rulers give it to the monasteries? So Bronkhorst explains that in the later chapters why these things, these donations developed and what do they mean? What stories do they tell about the society and the statecraft, politics, etc.? Because it shows that even the whole debate about ashramas and agraharas, about Sanskrit, the language, basically tells us what was happening on the ground, the changes that were happening in the polity that he examines later. What can be surmised here is that the Magadha Empire was vast and therefore it was a conglomeration and there were the Jains were powerful rather because there is a story that Chandragupta Maurya even came to Karnataka with Jains and he was a supporter of Jains. We don't know, but Karnataka is very, very rich with Jaina literature and had a very strong presence in Karnataka. But that's the claim of some historians that he moves to Karnataka. We have seen in his previous book, How the Brahmins Won, how before the creation of the Mauryan Empire, the Northwest was, as I mentioned earlier, accepted as Yavanas by the Greeks. By 300 BCE, the region had become Mauryan and the collapse had already begun. Collapse of Brahmanism had begun. So at that time, in the north, the western regions where the Buddhism flourished had to reinterpret their doctrine by that all composite objects consist of ultimate constituents. So Buddhism had to little redefine itself. This is a very abstract thing. The question is, we are all made, everything that we see is made up of many composite objects. They consist of ultimate constituents. The ultimate constituents are dharma, not composite elements. So this is the kind of reinvention that happens within Buddhism. There are all the things that we see, the kind of components, composite components are mere succession of momentary objects which have little duration. Therefore, they are impermanent. So is dharma. The collection of various dharmas that people see around is a succession of various dharmas, and they are also like composite elements. Even they will collapse. In the sense, they are impermanent. So this is how the arguments want to explain that there is ultimately nothing to fall back upon. For example, quote from Bronkhost, which collaborates this a little more, maybe to make it clear. Let me quote it. If the objects of our ordinary, I'm quoting from Bronkhost, quote, if the objects of our ordinary experience, such as the house in which we live, the chariot we use for our journey, the jar from which we drink water, do not really exist, why do we believe they do? The answer that is offered is the following. These objects are nothing but words. We travel in a chariot, but when we think about it, we discover that a chariot is nothing but the collection of its parts, which are nothing but collection of their parts, and so on, until one reaches the ultimate constituents. In reality, there is only a collection of dharma. If you transfer this metaphor into philosophy, ultimately, everything is a collection of dharmas, but the word chariot makes us believe that there is a chariot as well. So it's an illusion. One final question needs to be asked. Did the Buddhists of the northeastern region invent this ontology out of nothing? Did they just make it up? The correct answer is probably both yes and no. That's what Bronkhost is saying. Anything remotely resembling this ontology is completely foreign to all we know about earlier Buddhism. At the same time, the doctors from the Northwest Pandits rather, made an effort to anchor their ideas in traditional Buddhist concepts. The word rejection of a self, for example, had become a rejection of a person, thought of as the collection of all that makes a human being. The conclusion was drawn that this collection does not exist because no collections exist. The lists of ultimate constituents of these Buddhists were slightly adopted lists of important elements in the teaching of Buddha, drawn from early Buddhists. That means the momentary nature of all that exists was deduced from declaration by the Buddha to the extent that everything is impermanent. For in a debate, so this is how the debate went on. It says that there was certainly debates between various um, religious heads or pandits, and where the ideas were challenged. To hold one's ground in a debate, one had to make sure that the ideas were which one presented were internally coherent. The changes in Buddhist thought, just described above, all boil down to one thing. These are all attempts to bring coherence into a set of received ideas. That means this kind of small changes in the ontological understanding of the self, of impermanence, ultimate constituent body, ultimate body, etc., is a result of the kind of debates that went on between various dharmas. And because they had to provide a very coherent argument, we see this kind of thought emerging. So these ideas were welded together into a coherent system of thought, which ultimately got into the whole corpus of Buddhist thought. So this is what one would expect to happen in a situation where the Buddhists were challenged in debate. And this is what we see did happen. So through debates, there was kind of influence and also a very keen desire to create a coherent argument, which also produced new ways of interpreting whatever that was believed. So this is the point he's making. So this shows that Buddhism had come under the influence of many religions in the debates, not necessarily one. So therefore, he shows ultimately Buddhism had to contend with Brahmanism. That is not denied. But that happened at a time when Brahmanism reinvented itself, not the Brahmanism that was there at the time of Buddha. So to understand how Brahmanism reinvented itself, part of which we saw in the last book that we read, and also in the process of reinvention, what kind of changes happened in its encounter with Buddhism and in encounter with kings in society is explained in the four sections, like the new Brahmanism, the spread of Sanskrit, the Brahmanical colonization of the past, and the Brahmanization and the borrowed features. So even Brahmanization borrowed a lot. Now, we do not actually have time to go into all this, so I will stick to only one right now and get into this in the next session whenever we can have it. So we have seen how the empire, the unification of Magadha Empire, created certain adverse conditions for Brahmins, which made them to spread. And they were isolated, but that was not the dominant thing. We have seen that. In fact, these elements should have put an end to their existence. In fact, it could have disappeared. There were conditions so that maybe it could have disappeared, but it did not. It did not because precisely Brahmanism reinvented itself, and this reinvented Brahmanism ultimately went on to conquer the subcontinent beyond India. It even reached Cambodia, Japan, everything. It is in this context that we need to see how Buddhism came under the influence of Brahmanism. So when we understand, or when we want to try to understand what kind of how Buddhism got influenced by Brahmanism, we have to understand what kind of Brahmanism it was that influenced Buddhism, and that was the reinvented Brahmanism. For Buddhism, it was a long drawn confrontation that ended in its almost complete disappearance from the subcontinent. And as I mentioned, that complete disappearance is not accepted today because there are evidences to show it did not, but still, that's the general understanding. The remark that almost complete disappearance has to be taken with a pinch of salt, but let's take it that way and then continue. Uh, Bronkhost quotes that the German Egyptologist Jan Assmann that who offers an interesting distinction between primary and secondary religions. So this distinction he borrows from an Egyptologist. Now, what is this distinction? There is something called primary religion and secondary religion. Primary religions are basically very local. They have a belief system within themselves. They do not proselytize in the sense they don't convert anybody, nor do they project their beliefs as the universal truths. So, primary religions are those which do not create claims to universal truths. And because they don't do so, they do not proselytize. And because they do not proselytize, they are not interested in converting others into its fold. Whereas the secondary religions are the ones which are derived from this, which claim to universal truths. And because they claim universal truths, they try to proselytize, they try to convert. Now, in this scheme, what is interesting is that the, the earlier Vedic Brahmanism was a sect, was a set of beliefs. They believed that, they had the access to truth. They knew it. They were the only ones. But there was no conversion. So even today, there is no conversion possible. Brahmins don't convert. Rather, there is no conversion in Hinduism itself. That's a different matter. But anyway, um, no, it's when I take a small detour to make you think how Hinduism still believes it can be seen as primary religion because each of the jatis, each of the subsects and the belief systems, um, they they don't they don't claim that they are the only universal truths. The others are equally accepted. It is this kind of Hinduism that's under threat now, because Hindutva is a secondary religion in that sense where it tries to proselytize. So there's a garvapasi, it's possible. Though they claim it, though it's not possible to bring them back to any religion or any caste they want, we still hear about them. But so it's possible. I'm just suggesting that it's possible to interpret this distinction in today's times like that. In fact, Christianity, which later developed into the second religion, you see, it proselytized, it converted, and then it even made people, I mean, poets like Wordsworth, saying, this world is too much with us, getting and spending. So he says, very interestingly, I would rather be a pagan, a pre-Christian. I would rather be a pagan. I'm quoting from Wordsworth's poem, The World is Too Much with Us. I would rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn. And he cries, little we in nature, little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. So rather, I would be a pagan and suckled in creeds outworn. So which means that he is in a way saying that it's better to go back to a time when there were only primary religions. The secondary religions create this kind of havoc. But the point here is, it is during Magadha again, this reinvention happened slowly to both Buddhists and Brahmins. In other words, the religions were gaining, if you want to call it, were converting themselves to the second religion in the sense mentioned above. But they may not necessarily borrow, when they do it, they may not necessarily borrow from their primary religions. They borrow from other sources. So that is how their ideologies and practices get altered. For example, primary religions, primary religions are each indissociably linked to one single culture, to one single society, and commonly to one single language. Examples are the ancient Egyptian, Babylonian, Greco-Roman religions. But unlike primary religions, second religions have universal claims. They claim to be, at least in theory, applicable to all and to be in the possession of a unique truth. Primary religions do not have such exclusive truth claims. Maybe even hundreds of different small sects in India which believe in their own God, they don't make any universal claims. They still have remained at that level. So, as you have seen, Ashoka's dharma was moral, and therefore we see that Jainism and Buddhism, they were underway in their process to reinvent themselves. And but the Brahmanism, which was not a religion per se, that story is different. So this thing, I'll stop here now. The distinction here is to suggest how Brahmanism moved, reinvented. It is not that it moved from the primary to the secondary. Uh, it did not make any big religious truth claims about it, except those who believed their own sect. Therefore, it did not try to proselytize. So it behaves like the primary religion in many ways, but it also behaves like a second religion when it exposed itself to many other influences and had to correct itself and had to claim that they were the ones who were knowledgeable in predicting the future. They were the ones who could become the right counselors for the king. So they started influencing the statecraft. So that means the philosophy was brought down to certain practices. And they also needed a systemic support of rulers to conduct their Vedic tradition. In other words, Bronkhorst somewhere argues that the motive between, one of the motives, we can say, Ramayana and Mahabharata is to prove this reinvented Brahminism is inevitable. Brahmins are inevitable counselors and influencers who statecraft. He also tells how the reinvented Brahminism created the story of Chanakya, who single-handedly created the Mauryan Empire. It's a wonderful story, very interesting to read, but not historically tenable. So the stories that came about later in Kautilya, in Chanakyas, these are all literary texts composed by different people, which proved how it's important to create textual evidence to colonize the past. That's what he means. Colonizing the past is nothing but writing stories about. For example, one of the examples that he gives for the colonizing of the past that generally happens is that when Buddha Charita, Ashwagosha wrote Buddha Charita in Sanskrit, that's also important language. He says it's the Brahmin who came and predicted that this newborn would be a great man. Either he would conquer the world or a great king. Um, so this story gets implemented. Um, so therefore, the reinvented Brahminism altered the nature of the ritual sacrifice, gave up some, retained some, broadened their services, which they never did earlier, like they were the uh, Prohits, not sorry, a priestly class who would predict the well-being of the kings, their future, and counseling the kings in their practical arts of statecraft and governing, like Kautilya's Arthashastra. That is, they could interpret signs, they could pronounce curses and blessings, and um, that way they occupied the highest position in society. Even then, to begin with, the idea of four varnas were not still dominant in society, because there are many references, Bronkhost quotes, to Brahmins and even Kshatriyas. Um, there are references to them in the Ashoka Sutra, the inscriptions also we saw. And as even in Tamil Nadu, the reference to one of these sects, sorry, one of the Varnas, they were not called Varnas at that moment, but still reference to Kshatriyas and Brahmins did not appear till 300 BC. Though there were presence of Brahminical households, there is no evidence of Varna ideology, which appeared only in the later stages, as we see in Tolkappiyam. So Champaka Lakshmi, who has written extensively on the trade, ideology, and urbanization of South India in 300 BC to 1300 AD, points out how till about Tolkappiyam was written, and there was no reference to the Varna. So the reference to the various Kshatriyas by itself, Bronkhost argues, does not indicate the Varna system had got already settled and sediment, which happened much later. Even Buddhist texts mention the names Kshatriya, Brahmana, and Grihapati. Some people interpret the Grihapati as the Vaishya. There's no reference to the class called Shudra, or Varna called Shudra. But as mentioned earlier, the reference to these terms doesn't mean that the Varna was already, the society was classified under these four Varnas. This is also corroborated by Uma Chakravarti's study on the social dimension of Buddhism, the 1987 text, which Bronkhost quotes with approval. But there is a reference in one of the earliest suttas, the Sayana Sutra, which says that Greeks had no varnas, but there are only two divisions, masters and slaves, which shows that by the time this sutta was written, they, they had heard about varnas. So, commenting on that, the Buddhist Sutra says there are only two varnas, the masters and slaves, and they are also impermanent because they can change places. So we see therefore that what Buddhism had to contend was this kind of Brahmanism, which had spread very, very wide and by that time because of the association with Sanskrit, association with the texts, and largely because of the donations they received by the kings in the form of agraharas. So this patronage to Brahmanism slowly pushed Buddhism aside. And since Buddhism did not have a priestly class, once the monks were thrown out, there was nobody to carry this. Whereas even when Brahmanism underwent a lot of attacks and had unfavorable conditions, the priests, that is, those who claimed they had access to higher truths, they remained. And therefore, the priestly class in Brahmanism was not destroyed at all, which emerged later and spread and became powerful. So that, my friends, is the story till now. So we can examine how this invention happened, continued, and where exactly this clash between Buddhism and Brahmanism happened, and how ultimately we know the story. Brahmanism adopted and appropriated Buddhism, making him one more avatar. Uh, but in this process, Buddhism also borrowed heavily from Brahmanism, I think. And but it failed to reinvent in the way Brahmanism reinvented. But that is the story of this book, and we can revisit. Sorry, we can expand this with some greater detail in our next session. Thank you. Stop here. Sorry for this long intervention.
Thank you, comrade, for this very, very important work, introduction to this very important work, which
Bhargav, you
has
are here?
been.
Uh,
Hello, can you
Thank you,
hear?
Professor Sreedhar, for this excellent presentation. And I personally, really like the book because I, I have a lot of questions. And but once you
Yeah, yeah.
read that book, it appears so convincing that it puts your all understanding of Brahmanism and Buddhism on its head. That's what I found. But there are many questions. There will be many questions from friends.
There are.
Yeah, please. So, as we normally do, there is one first round of immediate comments of comrades, and then we take up questions. So, I request everyone to to ask their immediate comments about the book, about the presentation, and then we can continue with that. Please.
Bhargav has just started saying something when you, Subhash Nusul.
It's okay. It's okay.
Yeah,
Subhash,
go ahead, Bhargav.
Subhash could not hear my voice, I guess. So it's okay. Subhash, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, okay, okay. Then I was just saying that thanking Comrade Sridhar for this wonderful introduction to this important book. Uh, and as Subhash said, we will have one round of immediate comments and reactions first, and then later take substantive questions if there are any. And as Comrade Sridhar has less time with us, we have a half an hour. As Comrade Sridhar mentioned that after 12 o'clock we may not be available. So this half an hour we will take this opportunity
It's
to.
okay, but 10 minutes this way was okay. No problem.
Okay. So let us have a one round
In
of quick round of immediate responses. Then we can take up questions, substantive questions if there are any.
Can
I would like to share my immediate comment. I mean, even I was not present in the last session, but I heard the recording. What it does is that it actually creates much more nuanced understanding of how both Brahminism and today's talk about Buddhism, in terms of got entrenched in our society, or slowly moved in our society. So that simplistic understanding of, for example, those who are with the movement and organized and generally progressive thinking is about positioning Buddhism, the best part of Buddhist thought versus the worst part of the Hindu religion. So that's how we generally talk. But you are sharing, and the way that you introduced breaks that stereotyping, and it kind of gives a layered sense of how these religions kind of found their roots in the society, and also how they changed and transformed. In that way, it is very useful, and I thank you.
thank you, thank you. Particularly, Brancott doesn't make a claim, in thin air. So we may disagree with him, but then whatever points he makes, for everything that he utters, he has certain footnotes, evidence, reference. So that makes it really scholarly. As I mentioned earlier, he doesn't have a very a kind of socialist agenda to prove anything. So that I perhaps helps him to pursue this in a very impassioned way. Whereas Ambedkar, so it also shows that um, that many references that Ambedkar gives are incomplete actually. I mean, one has to study that. I'm just giving it as an offshoot of my reading of this book. I have also read his Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Ancient India thoroughly. He also gives a lot of references, but then there are so many other references that would have countered his own argument. Maybe either he had no access to them, maybe that may be one of the reasons. He was not a trained historian, he was an economist. So that may be one of the reasons why there are many evidences that whatever that he uses, that falls in line very clearly with his argument.
Ambedkar's account, one immediate striking thing that comes to our mind after Bronkhost's analysis is that, for example, Ambedkar's depiction of ancient India as basically a battle between Brahmanism and Buddhism represented revolution, and Brahmanism counter-revolution. It is more dramatic and it's more political in the sense that for immediate political ideological purposes, he depicts that, but it is more dramatic and it's more stereotypical. Whereas Bronkhost, with his painstaking study, with his rigorous analysis based on data, texts, and all that, it is a gradual adaptation to the increasingly dominant uh, Brahmanism, especially in the later stages of Buddhism, especially after second century BC and onwards. And whereas the Brahmanism the shadow of Brahmanism that Bronkhost is speaking is more of an intellectual cultural ecosystem, shadow of Brahminical intellectual cultural ecosystem that is becoming more and more dominant. So it's kind of a civilizational shadow rather than a theological shadow. So while Buddhists retained their ethical doctrine and their doctrine, they retained that core, but they had to adopt and adjust their narratives, their argumentation, and their way of presentation, make themselves more presentable in a world which is increasingly dominated by the Brahminical worldview and cultural ecosystem and all that. So in that way, his is much more nuanced analysis, and it is less dramatic and more historical.
More historical, and also grounded in continuously on what was happening.
Yes.
And on the ground. Because that is the material basis. In a way, although he doesn't claim he's a Marxist, etc., but he's trying to ground it on what was happening, the changes in the kingdom, in the statecraft, and for example, he mentions how the removal of kings and the establishment of governors created a havoc. It just removed Brahmins from their profession.
Absolutely.
So they had to move around. And so the consolidation of an empire may have many things. One of them is this offshoots.
Yes.
And
Probably
and I find that if we extend this idea of the primary and secondary religion to the contemporary times, we can see that it has certain relevance to understand how Hindutva, for example, is an attempt to create a secondary religion out of a primary. I'm just making a little talk line. Because it's not a religion at all in that sense, Hinduism. Therefore, there is an attempt to create one. That's the problem. But because we have been using the term extensively, that term becomes a truth. That's the example that Buddha gives. See, you call a chariot because that is the word that we keep using because of its function. But if you begin to probe, you can see it's made up of so many parts. And ultimately, what is that? So that's how it is.
Even though there is a problem with this that Buddhist practice of considering everything into breaking everything
Exactly.
into parts, and finally
There is a problem.
there is nothing ontologically, but there are certain things called wholes, which are much bigger than the sum of all the parts. They have their own properties, independent party, emergent
I know,
property.
I know, I know.
So, but one interesting thing is that, broadly speaking, large empires are disadvantaged to Brahminism, in at least in large parts. But only one exception, that Gupta Empire, even though which succeeded Mauryan Empire in its scope and influence, at least across the North India. That's the one empire which actively promoted Brahminism, even though it never suppressed other religious
Religions.
traditions, but nonetheless it actively promoted, patronized Brahminism. They themselves called that they are Parama Bhagavatars. They are from the Vaishnava Bhagavata tradition. So there, I think that is the crucial period when Brahmanism has reinvented itself, as you were saying and Bronkhost was saying, reinventing Brahmanism, absorbing many tenets of Jainism and Buddhism, and becoming much more robust in the sense that all the important positive elements that they can get from Buddhism and Jainism, they have adopted. They Brahmins themselves reinvented themselves from Kattar non-vegetarians to Kattar Shakaharis and all those things. So they adopted themselves. By that they became quite strong. So
Bhargav,
uh,
Rosa was raising her hand. So,
yeah, Ramani.
yeah.
May I audible?
Oh,
Ah,
yeah.
It is good to hear all these things. And I'm just having one curiosity. You are saying that Chanakya, no such person, there is no historical evidence for the existence of the person Chanakya. But it is said that Kautilya and Chanakya are one another same, and Kautilya also wrote Ardhashastra. So, is this true? Is there any historical evidence that both are same or not?
See, the question here is not whether there was a person called Chanakya. That's not the question. The question here is that they created a story that Chanakya invented the Maurya Empire single-handedly, Chandragupta. So that's the story we have been told. So it is this kind of narratives that was a part of the reinvention that the Brahmins tried. They even went up to Buddha, and I mean, you can see that Buddha himself had a Brahmin predicting what he would be in the future. So it is that story that there is a text, no doubt. There must be a collection of whatever sutras Chanakya gave, yes, but it shows how the Brahmins became materialistic in the sense, quote unquote, entered into advising kings about the statecraft. That was not their profession earlier in the Vedic times. So we don't have any reference to that in the Vedas. But we see that in the post-reinvented Brahmanism, they introduce all these things into their literature. Maybe they inscribed them and then said that, yes, there is this great tradition. So this creation of inventing tradition is an important part of all revivalists, I think. That happens even. For example, you can see that this kind of a small reinvention is not new. There is a reference to the early Upanishads, I'm quoting from Bronkhost, the early Upanishads strongly criticize the sacrifice and focus on other activities as the practices which most give knowledge authority. This movement away from sacrifice at a textual level, animal sacrifice, indicates that the composers and editors of the Upanishads were attempting to define their roles as Brahmins in different ways to audiences who no longer found the sacrifice favorable. So even Upanishadic texts had these insertions where um, they started proclaiming that yes, we do not support animal sacrifice because that was not favorable to the society. So not only do Brahmins define themselves as teachers and court priests rather than the ritualists, but also the ideal king is one who learns philosophy and hosts philosophical debates rather than one who is the patron of sacrifice. So this is the Chandogya Upanishad. So instead of becoming a patron of yagna, what do you call that? The leader of the yagna, you arrange debates, you take interest in philosophical debates. That is how a king should perform. So etc. is given in Upanishad, Chandogya Upanishad, which they think is a later addition. That is how we see that in the later Vedas, Yajurveda, Samveda, Atharva Veda, the corpus of histories and ancient tales, ancestral rites, mathematics, soothsaying, the art of local treasures, dialogues, the science of gods, the science of the ritual, the science of spirits, the science of government, the science of heavenly bodies, and the science of serpent beings. All that was inserted into this in the form of knowledge. So this kind of creation of a new body of knowledge gave them this power. If you make this relation between knowledge and power, this is how this works.
Concept of Rajarshi.
Rajarshi.
There is not much time, so are there any comments? Subhash, can I make some comment? Yeah. I'm sorry if I am stopping others from making first reactions or comments, but because Sreedhara has to leave, so it's a very interesting presentation and very important help that Sreedhar is giving to the whole group. It very closely relates with a challenge that we feel, but I feel that it's a challenge for all the movements, especially left movement and progressive social movements. About first, is there any need to claim ancient India or claim past at all? For our political and movement reasons, do we need to get into that? And if we do need to get into that, then we have to see what kind of conceptualization of idea of India we ourselves have. If we come to the conclusion, partly in NSI we often discuss that, and we have partly come to the conclusion that the idea of India plays a very active role in the political developments of the present. And we have seen, for example, as Sreedhar was saying, Brahmins, when they reinvented themselves in post-Maurya period, they colonized the past. And if I use that metaphor, I almost feel like, we as leftists and many social movements, anti-caste, anti-patriarchy movements, we fight from liberation of Brahminical colonization. Or let me put it this way, should we fight the Brahminical colonization of India's past by creating our own past that fits very well with our political project? So in a way, I am saying that should we liberate ourselves from Brahminical colonization and create our own colonization of past, or we will have to do something a little bit different? And I feel that we will have to do something a little bit different, which is being, as far as possible, without leaving our political project, as far as possible, we have to become historical. And the problem that I see, even though I admire Ambedkar and his political project as well as, his scholarship, and I recognize that, he was one of the initial modern day commentators on India's past from the lens of anti-caste movement. But there are big gaps, and the anti-caste movement, anti-patriarchy movement, they have created their own India. They have created their own India, which is not historical. We accept more readily that because it is an India created that fits into our political project. And we will have to understand why Brahminical colonization became so acceptable, so hegemonic, so popular in subsequent centuries. And if we want to understand that, the reasons behind the remarkable success of Brahminical ideology, then there is no way but to dig deeper, as with the help of the present author Bronkhost and many others. And in that, the Indian scholarly work, even though commendable, is still it's lacking. And I'm not saying this as a including whoever, Irfan Habib's, little booklets that he had published in last decade or so. One of the booklets is on ancient India. Or if you take great scholars of ancient India like, Romila Thapar and her advisor Basham, and so on. I think only ground has been, scholars have only scratched the surface. And one of the reasons why I admire Bronkhost is that he is saying that most of the research is yet to be done. That it's a field that is just starting. So there are many questions, and first we have to fix our approach. Our approach, without leaving our political project, we have to try to be as historical as possible. So there is no escape from going into this kind of exercise that we are doing today, is going into some scholarly books and kind of be informed or educated about whatever actual research has been done about India's past. This is very much part of our work, and this very much relates to our political project. So that's the general comment. So I am just commending Sreedhar's effort in presenting that book and his ideas in that light. Beyond that, I think we will have more discussion next time, because it's the key question is that why did Brahmins succeed? One of the books, I think one volume was named that, why did Brahmins win? So and this book starts discussing that Brahmins reinvented themselves, and as Sreedhar will present next time, we will see that Brahmanism is more a more a political social ideology than a religion. It's not a religion. They never claim to be a religion, but it's a more a political social ideology. And they defeated Buddhism, which Sreedhara, I'm sure, will shed more light than I can next time, in our next session. They succeeded by being very practical. They had things to advise to kings. They had things to say about how to run a state, how to constitute a state, how to organize a society, how to think about this and how to think about that, including what is the universe about and who are Rahu and Ketu, and why does eclipse happens at a certain time, and add to that, telling individuals that, okay, this is good for you and that is bad for you, and look for these omens and those signs in the stars and in the eclipse about, what is going to befall you. Buddhism ridiculed that at that time in the beginning. I mean, not the initial Buddhism too, but later on it ridiculed that, that Buddhism was a more like a philosophy of individual's liberation, So it was not a social philosophy as much as a philosophy of individual revolution, and it did not get into advising kings. And as Bronkhost later on says, that what Sreedhar will come to in the next session, Bronkhost says that they yielded to Brahmins, that, okay, you guys go ahead and advise the king and create his state, and, have the Chaturvarna or whatever, organize the society, Obliquely, the Buddhists, they did not agree with Chaturvarna, but they accepted that, yes, society has Chaturvarna. Chaturvarna is a social reality. They accepted that, So Buddhists kept away from that. And when Brahmins adopted some of the Buddhist practices, like ashramas and, so on, or at least learned from them, leading to agraharas, or maybe ashramas and agraharas were coexistent, having same, existing at the same time. They used everything to increase their influence. So when we come back to the question of, if this is not religion, then why did it succeed, in this classification? I mean, that classification is interesting too: primary religion and secondary religion. Now, if Brahmanism was not a religion, it was neither primary nor secondary, but it appears as though it made use of both, because Brahmanism spread on the society as an umbrella. Underneath there were many primary religions. Primary religions are local, regional, rooted in a culture, cannot be transported to another culture, So in the axial debate, our discussion on axial civilizations, we talked about native, pre-axial civilizations, who are native gods and native cultures and so on. And axial civilizations came as claim to another world existing, that is the ideal world, and this world is to be reorganized according to the ideal world. And the claims of universality had its foundation in the existence of the other world. So if we compare that classification with the primary and secondary religion classification, there is some overlap and there is some difference. We will probably debate that in future. But important point is that Brahmanism, even though not religion, at times acted as a secondary religion under which many primary religions existed. So that is what, Brahmanism, and you can extend that to calling contemporary modern understanding of Hinduism, that Hinduism was some overarching thing under which, many sects and many practices and many local cultural variations, all of them existed, So that probably was the success of Brahmanism. And Brahmanism was, and not a religion, if it thrived on protecting the local, then why did it travel and why did it become cosmopolitan? At least its language and many of its practices became cosmopolitan because it spread to Southeast Asia in a big way. So Brahmins did not travel as much, even though some did. But Brahmanism, through Sanskrit and through some ritualistic practices, did travel to Southeast Asia too. So those these things I'm just flagging for our next time's discussion, and also raising some things. For example, will have to be, I think, patient, and we cannot rush to very quick conclusions. And that is one thing. Left has not done its job. A standard left does not feel the need to think about India's past. Okay. It does not see that, and if it thinks about India's past, then, as some other scholars have pointed out, even great historians like Irfan Habib and R.S. Sharma and others think of India's past in terms of, some variation on feudalism or some kind of class society, in which class struggle happens. And all these historical developments that came in the form of culture and religion, they were just mere expressions of the class struggles of those times. Even the great historians do that, from the Marxist side, and that's a limitation. Future left will have to go beyond that, because history was not just that. Even though class struggle was always there, and class struggle may have been at the root of many of the cultural phenomena, and yet you cannot reduce everything that happened in history to feudalism, or India's Asiatic mode, or India's version of feudalism, or whatever you call it. So we will have to be more patient. We will have to know the reason why we are spending time on this, and we should not come to quick conclusions. For example, the first Brahminical empire was that of Shungas, not of Guptas. Guptas supported everybody, even though they were themselves, under the Brahminical, they were Brahminical, but they supported everybody. Shunga, the first guy, Pushyamitra Shung, killed the last Maurya emperor, and started his Brahminical empire. That was the only Brahminical empire. But Brahminical influence was on all empires, on all empires. The empires were not too many, but on all subsequent empires, Brahminical impact was there. So that's a puzzle. The question, why did Brahmins win? The second thing is that, just to conclude, when we claim idea of India and substantiate it by our concrete understanding of India's history, as historically it can be known, as concretely and factually it can be known, then we will have to replace, or at least we will have to differentiate between the task of passing a judgment on this or that religion, this or that ideology, this or that sect. From today's vantage point, we will have to first understand history in its own times. We will have to understand the phenomena in its own times. And in the social movement, and of course in left, there is this rush to pronounce judgments. All India's ancient history has been handed over to our adversaries by saying that all that India had in the ancient times was Brahminism and patriarchy. Chaturvarna and patriarchy. Now, that is not how any civilization, any progressive reclaiming of one's own history and past should not be done in that way. That from today's your project and from today's ideological viewpoint, you pass the judgment on all the characters of history and don't look at those characters and ideologies in the historical settings in which they were operating in their own times. So you cannot, we cannot imitate what the Brahmins did. So we cannot reclaim, colonized past. We cannot liberate ourselves from Brahminism and then bring everybody else into our colony, make India's past becoming our colony. So India's past should not become a leftist colony once it is liberated from being Brahminical colony. So that is a methodological question that debate will go on for a long time, because we as leftists are too accustomed to passing judgment and looking at history in such black and white terms that everything in ancient India, it is glorious for Hindutva and it is all, only oppression and superstition and everything else for us, So that I think, that is the rationale behind um, this exercise, and we should very vigorously uh, continue it, because, I mean, left has not reconstructed India's past for its own purpose. It has just whitewashed it. Left has whitewashed India's purpose, and most social movements have, including Ambedkar, have whitewashed India's past. Ambedkar is a better example because he had some scholarship too. But generally, without knowing, we know everything about India's past, and that is what um, gives uh, makes our adversaries' tasks very easy. That is what makes the Hindutva task very easy. So Hindutva has to be challenged by reclaiming history in a historical way, reclaiming India, as it was, and then we have to explain that we are not passing a judgment of this versus that. That is how India was. And then we have to see where did we come from, and in that, we will talk later. Maybe I shouldn't take too much time. That, even the post-colonial theorists, leftists, anti-caste movements, everybody has one-dimensional understanding of India's past from one's own location. And everybody is in a hurry to prove his or her current project and create an India, that fits into our current project. And that even if the argument becomes much more difficult, still we should make argument in this way and not colonize India's past in a Brahminical way, although for a leftist purpose.
There are very active Buddhist rumor mills and Buddhist WhatsApp universities actively working in certain parts of Maharashtra, and their influence is growing even in Telugu states and in Karnataka and southern parts also. They have very, very bizarre stories about how Buddha, every part of current Hinduism is how it originated in Buddhism. And Hinduism is nothing but a brazen, shameless copying of Buddhism. So this way of reclaiming past will not help. So this Comrade Devi has posed a question that is related to this Buddhist WhatsApp University. In comment section, we can see she is somewhere outside, so she's
Yeah,
unable
I
to
can see
talk.
that. I can see that.
So thank you, sir, for the excellent session. I was outside, so I could not talk to you. My question is, nowadays, some people attribute almost every philosophy, tradition, social idea to the Buddha. For example, they claim that Buddha is Shiva, Buddha is Balaji, or that even Karl Marx was influenced by the Buddha. Since today's discussion was about the historical relationship with Buddhism and Brahmanism, how should we distinguish between genuine historical influence, later cultural assimilation, and overinterpretation? How should we respond to such sweeping claims in evidence-based way?
I think certainly we should address this question once we complete this. Because see, I divided this into two parts mainly because this is largely argumentative, theoretical. Rest of it, he draws a lot of evidence to show, for example, from Sanskrit, from ashram, whether it's ashram or agrahara, whether how much of influence percolated to Buddhists, what was the reciprocity of it. All these questions he's addressing in the later part. And we are sure that he will not address them only theoretically. So these are always grounded to the extent possible. And therefore, ultimately, that question that Ravi raised is important, right? How do we reclaim our past? Because there is a lot of wisdom in that also. A lot of investigations, a lot of mathematical and astrological investigations. So they did work also on that. It's not that everything that the Brahmins will claim to knowledge is only conspiratorial or trying to colonize. So things won't be like that. So if we keep away from neat binary opposites and very linear narratives of either our past or our future, we will get into a rather clearer understanding of where we stand. So I thought that I suggest that I will present the rest of the book in the next session, along with some questions that also come to me, so that the those who listen to it may also add to that. So I'll send those questions in advance along with the synopsis, and we'll fix up a date after certain gap. And then perhaps I will also see to it that there is a lot of time available at that time for discussion. Okay. So we'll have a lot of time then. Because this suddenly cropped up.
We can have, Sreedhar, if you agree, we can have more than one session. You can take next 2-3 sessions.
Oh, no, let me see. let me see. Because it's a lot of material there as evidence in the next part. But anyway, that we can summarize. But we have to call out the argument he's making. That's the point. I'll try to do that next time. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, listening to me, and also keeping this, bringing these books to our notice. We should thank Comrade Ravi for that. Now, I think, having read these two, we'll have to read the 2 more books in a later date. But this is a very interesting corpus of knowledge. And like any other Orientalist Western scholar, see, he studied in Pune, actually. He went back and studied in, I think, Netherlands or so. I don't know. That means he studied in both kinds of educational system. But largely we see that he belongs to that kind of scholarship, like Nidham, for example. Always evidence-based, nothing claimed. No hypothesis has been left, hanging in midair. We may agree with it, that's a different story. But he's drawing certain things from that. So that sticking to a certain methodological principle is what that makes this book something that we cannot ignore easily.
And my suggestion would be to Comrade Caesar, we don't need to wait for next month to have our second session. If you have already prepared notes and all that, we can, according to your convenience, we can have it in maybe
I will talk to Madhavi
a week or two,
sure.
So that this tone, this interest, and this intensity will not fizzle out, and we'll continue this discussion.
Sure, I will.
So please suggest your convenient date in a week or
I'll do that. I'll just look into this.
So that we can continue it.
Yeah. I will talk to Madhavi and let you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we can conclude and we can take this discussion in the next session. Because other part we need to hear from Comrade Sreedhar. Then we will have a much more elaborate discussion on this issue. If there are no other questions, maybe we can move to closing the session.
Okay, I had lost power again. I am connected with the phone, so I didn't hear. But if we are concluding, then yeah, okay. Bye, Sreedhar.
Sir, thank you, sir. Bye.
Thank you, Comrade.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, Sreedhar.